Good morning, everyone. Great to have you joining us today. I am Laura Schrake with the Council of the Great Lakes Region. And on behalf of the Council, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this morning's webinar. Today is a special edition of our monthly webinar series. And we have just 25 minutes planned for this morning's webinar, which will be quite informative. We will get an update on recent litigation and the consent decree that is putting Lake Erie on a pollution diet, requiring limits for nutrient pollution runoff. So some quick stage setting. Lake Erie is the southernmost lake of the Great Lakes. It is also the shallowest and the smallest by volume. And along with the other Great Lakes, it is vulnerable to pollutants and habitat destruction. Lake Erie often suffers from high amounts of nutrients and pollution due to runoff from surrounding industries, agriculture, and urbanization, which has resulted in all too frequent toxic algal blooms, impacting the lake's water quality. Last month, following 6 years of public interest litigation, a federal judge in Ohio approved a consent decree that requires the Ohio EPA to submit a plan known as Total Maximum Daily Load, or TMDL, to specify the maximum amount of pollution the waterway can tolerate, addressing all harmful nutrients sufficient to remedy the lake. This is a really important step towards restoring Lake Erie's western basin and an important step for the residents who rely on its waters, including the millions of people who depend on Lake Erie for their drinking water. The ruling is a result of the persistence of the Environmental Law and Policy Center and the Board of Lucas County Commissioners in Ohio, who pressed for accountability with cleaning up the lake. So today we are going to learn more. We will hear from Howard Lerner of the Environmental Law and Policy Center, who has been at the center of this litigation and who continues to stand committed to seeing a cleaner, healthier, and safer future for not only Lake Erie and its residents, but for all the Great Lakes. We will learn about the history of this litigation and what the consent decree means in the days and years ahead. So today's webinar, like I mentioned, is condensed into about 25 minutes. So let me introduce our esteemed guest speaker, Howard Lerner. Howard is an experienced attorney who serves as the Environmental Law and Policy Center's president and executive director. He served as the general counsel for business and professional people for the public interest, specializing in environmental, energy, economic development, and civil rights litigation and policy development. He was also the founding chair of the Illinois Citizens Utility Board and founding chair of the Midwest Energy Efficiency Alliance. And he has served on the executive committee and board of the Environmental Law Institute and as the vice chair of the US EPA's National Advisory Council on Environmental Policy and Technologies. And in addition to that impressive resume, I should also add that the Council of the Great Lakes region is very proud to have Howard on its board of directors. So Howard, I know you are very busy these days, so thank you for being with us. And I'm really looking forward to hearing more about this litigation and the consent decree from you.
Thank you very much, Laura, and thank you very much to the Council for putting this on. The Council of the Great Lakes region does terrific work, and I'm going to sort of walk you through the problem and what the litigation consent decree does. The problem is Lake Erie, particularly Western Lake Erie, is a binational and a regional disgrace. There are severe recurring toxic algae blooms almost every summer that impairs drinking water supply. It affects wildlife, it affects recreation. You've all seen the horrible pictures. We don't need to dwell on what the problem is. Everybody recognizes that. Indeed, the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, a binational agreement between the Canadian and US governments, federal governments, as well as between Ontario, Ohio, Michigan, the states, and Indiana around Lake Erie, make a commitment based on sound science to reduce pollution, phosphorus pollution, by 40% by 2025. And the science behind this is that that 40% reduction is necessary to reduce the toxic algae outbreaks 90% of the time. Okay, we're not talking about perfection here. We're talking about much better and good. But the fact of the matter is we're not anywhere close to that. The state of Ohio is responsible for about 70% of the phosphorus that goes into Western Lake Erie through the Maumee River Basin. And it's simply a math problem. Unless Ohio reduces by a heck of a lot, you can't reduce 40% overall. In other words, you can't get to 40% reduction unless you deal with 70% of the problem. And that 70% of the problem is scientifically known. It's not a mystery. The Ohio EPA recognizes that 90% of that phosphorus pollution comes from the agricultural sector. It's agricultural runoff, mostly fertilizers and manure that comes from concentrated animal feeding operations, CAFOs. So here we are trying to reduce by 40%, and that's a signed document, Annex 4 of the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, by the Canadian, the US federal governments, by the states and the provinces. And we're not on a path to getting there by 2025, because if you don't deal with Ohio, which is 70% of the problem, and the agricultural runoff, that's 90% of the problem, you can't get to 40% reduction. That's just math, okay? The Environmental Law and Policy Center, a community group in Toledo, and the Lucas County Board of Commissioners filed a lawsuit against the US EPA. We argued that the EPA's approval of the state of Ohio's plan was insufficient, that it was legally impermissible, it was arbitrary and capricious. The state of Ohio's plan, in our view, would not reduce pollution by anywhere near the amount that was necessary to get to 40% by 2025, or even sooner thereafter, or to solve the problem. And the problem and the solution is the cleanup of Western Lake Erie. First, the Ohio EPA said Western Lake Erie is not impaired under the Clean Water Act. The US EPA accepted that characterization, and that was reversed by the federal court as arbitrary and capricious. When you have a body of water like Western Lake Erie that's covered by severe toxic algae outbreaks almost every summer, it is impaired under the Clean Water Act. The court so found. When a water is impaired under the Clean Water Act, what that requires is that the state and the federal government do something called a TMDL, total maximum daily load. Some of you know a lot about that. Some of you may not. What that is in effect a pollution diet. It requires that the total maximum daily load of phosphorus going into the Maumee River Basin and ultimately that flows into Western Lake Erie has to be reduced by a sufficient amount to solve the problem. How much reduction do you need? You need enough so that 90% of the time that 90% of the toxic algae blooms are being avoided. And the science is that requires a 40% reduction in phosphorus. So in effect, the TMDLs have to be designed to achieve the 40% reduction in phosphorus so that Western Lake Erie is not in impaired water. That's how the Clean Water Act works. Again, the Ohio EPA and the US EPA argued that TMDLs were not required. The federal court issued an order and a ruling in response to the Environmental Law and Policy Centers and the Lucas County Board of Commissioners lawsuit that said, yes, indeed, TMDLs are required. We then had what are called cross motions for summary judgment. Those are extensive briefs that were submitted by both the government agencies, Lucas County Board of Commissioners, Environmental Law and Policy Center. We were filing consolidated briefs in most cases. We were also supported by the city of Toledo. So step back for a minute. Here you have both the environmental groups and the local governments fully aligned completely agreeing publicly, completely agreeing in the litigation before the court, oftentimes filing joint briefs, coordinating their approaches. There was no discernible difference between the positions that the government, local governments were taking, and the Environmental Law and Policy Center and Environmental Group were taking. We were acting in conjunction, in agreement, aligned well, filing coordinated briefs, taking similar positions before the court. We had an oral argument about almost 2 years ago at this point, and the court indicated that the parties should see if we might settle the case. This went on for a while. We had hearings twice before a different judge who acted to spur the parties to the settlement, and we came up with a consent decree. That consent decree, which I'll talk about in a minute, was approved by the US District Court for the Northern District of Ohio in an order on May 4th. And let me just show you what the judge said. I think it's well worth looking at the court's words. And here it is. Hopefully you can see it on your screen. The consent decree brings an end to litigation that has spanned for 2 weeks, short of 6 years. This is the final chapter in the plaintiffs. That's the Lucas County Board of Commissioners and the Environmental Law and Policy Center's persistent, unyielding quest to obtain a joint commitment from the EPA and the state of Ohio to undertake the crucial first step toward the restoration of Lake Erie's western basin. That's pretty easy to follow, but let me put it in just franker terms. What this requires is the state of Ohio and the US EPA to do TMDLs that are designed, and we hope sufficient, to clean up Western Lake Erie, namely restore Western Lake Erie so it's no longer an impaired water. The consent decree itself provides a schedule by which the state is supposed to develop the TMDLs, and then they're reviewed and approved or not by the federal government. And that's where we approach a problem here. The state of Ohio's final TMDLs are due tomorrow, June 30th, under the consent decree. They must do it by June 30th. There was a draft that was put out by the Ohio EPA, and I'll simply say that the Environmental Law and Policy Center, Lucas County Board of Commissioners, the Regional Council of Governments, and many others all filed comments that said, this is totally insufficient to solve the problem. These TMDLs won't work. The state of Ohio is relying upon a voluntary program called H2O Ohio, and it's unclear whether there'll even be sufficient funding from the legislature in H2O Ohio. But as Jeff Reuter, the lead scientist on Lake Erie, who chaired the science group for the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement Annex 4, put it, voluntary doesn't work here. It simply is not sufficient to solve the problem, namely the concentration of phosphorus in the shallow body of Western Lake Erie. It won't be sufficient to either reach 40% reduction by 2025 or to clean up Western Lake Erie in any reasonable way. The only way to get there is to have reasonable, tough but fair, enforceable regulatory standards that require those who are applying fertilizer to corn and soy fields to use best management practices and reduce the use of fertilizer. And that can save money for farmers. Sometimes that's called precision agriculture. And the second is to stop citing more concentrated animal feeding operations. Those CAFOs with 5,000, 8,000, 12,000 cows, pigs, chickens produce the expected amount of manure. And when that manure is put into a pit and then it's liquefied and sprayed on a field, it predictably gets into the water supply and it causes toxic algae outbreaks in Western Lake Erie. The state of Ohio needs to be permitting and citing fewer CAFOs, and it needs to require the CAFOs to manage the manure differently so it doesn't get into the Lake Erie water supply. Think about it in these terms. If Lerner Industries had a big chemical plant. And our chemical plant had a pipe that was emitting toxic chemicals and other materials into the Maumee River system that went into Western Lake Erie, we'd be sued immediately. The Clean Water Act puts limits on what pollution sources can be put into the waterways that lead to the contamination we now have in Western Lake Erie. When we have farm fields and agricultural fields that have tile drainage and manure is sprayed on the field, the same things happen. The tile drainage basically works as a pipe. It sluices the manure into the water system in the Maumee River Basin. It winds up in Western Lake Erie, and it causes severe recurring toxic algae outbreaks. That needs to be regulated. If the state of Ohio doesn't do that by tomorrow in its plan that's issued by June 30th, then under the consent decree, the US EPA needs to step up and act. The US EPA can either approve what the state of Ohio does, and we certainly hope it doesn't do that if the state of Ohio's final plan tomorrow is anything like its draft plan. If the US EPA were to approve that, quite likely the Lucas County Board of Commissioners and the Environmental Law and Policy Center would be back in court saying to the judge, they simply don't seem to get what they're required to do here to clean up Western Lake Erie. The US EPA can disapprove the state of Ohio's TMDLs. And in that case, the US EPA needs to work with Ohio for Ohio to either adopt TMDLs that are sufficient to deal with the problem, or the US EPA needs to draft the TMDLs itself. And there's a time frame under the consent decree essentially involving two 90-day periods in which the US EPA has to step up to the plate and decide what to do if the state of Ohio doesn't do its job sufficiently, and what the federal government needs to do in terms of moving forward with TMDLs. So here's where we are, folks. As of tomorrow, the state of Ohio will issue its final plan. At least it's scheduled to do so under the consent decree. To quote an old line, old song, wishing, hoping, thinking, and a praying that the state of Ohio's final plan is different than its draft plan. That would be a good thing, but I don't reasonably expect that's what's going to happen. So the ball is going to be in the court of the US EPA, and EPA headquarters and Region 5 EPA is going to have to decide at this point, is enough enough? If we had enough of severe recurring toxic algae outbreaks in Western Lake Erie, the time has come to clean up Western Lake Erie. And in order to do that, we need TMDLs that have enforceable regulatory standards that reduce the amount of fertilizers and manure, that phosphorus pollution that gets into Western Lake Erie by 40%. If not by 2025, we need to be on a path to doing that, and we need to do it soon, because that's what's necessary to clean up Western Lake Erie. The current situation is not acceptable to anybody, and it shouldn't be to people in either Toledo, Lucas County, in the United States, or in Canada. It's a disgrace. It needs to be cleaned up. And the pathway to do that requires action by the state of Ohio, requires action by the federal government, and it requires coordinated action by the Canadian and US federal governments and the states of Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, and the province of Ontario. We know how to do this. The science is there. What we need is the political will and the public support to move forward to clean up Western Lake Erie. And that's a goal that I think the public broadly shares, and all the public opinion polling shows that. Last point. Annex 4 of the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement that says that the states must reduce and the province must reduce phosphorus pollution by 40%, science-based, by 2025, was signed by the governors of the states and by the province. This isn't made up. This isn't some independent group of experts. Governor DeWine, the state of Ohio, has signed Annex 4, and Governor DeWine is committed on multiple occasions, both in the court filings and publicly, to comply with the 40% reduction by 2025. What the state of Ohio so far has proposed won't do that in a demonstrable scientific way, and we now need the political will, the public policy drive and support, and the US EPA to step up and do its job well when the state of Ohio isn't, right? That's what the consent decree should put us on a path to do. And the ultimate goal is to clean up and restore Western Lake Erie. And I think that's a goal that's shared by many. So thank you for the opportunity to present this morning. And I'd be glad to address, Laura, whatever questions have come up or places where you'd like me to provide some additional commentary.
Great. Thank you so much, Howard. That was a lot and a very nice summary of where we stand right now and how we got to this. So thank you very much. I know we don't have a lot of time. We have had a couple questions come in. I'm going to start with one that actually came in with the registration, who's asking about if you can provide an overview of how TMDLs can help hold industry accountable.
You have to look at what the source of the problem is in a particular watershed. So, for example, in Michigan, the Detroit wastewater treatment plant was a significant part of the amount of phosphorus that was going into Lake Erie. Detroit has now upgraded the wastewater treatment facility, so has Toledo. But when it comes now to the TMDL for Western Lake Erie in the state of Ohio, there's pretty widespread, well, there's total agreement. The state of Ohio EPA says that 90%, if not more, of the phosphorus getting into Western Lake Erie is from the agricultural sector, from agricultural runoff pollution. So the problem isn't heavy industry. The problem isn't fertilizers that people are using on their gardens in Toledo. 90% or more of the problem is coming from the agricultural sector, and that's really two places. It's fertilizer on corn and soy fields, excessive amounts of it that runs off, and it's manure that's sprayed on fields or otherwise comes out of manure pits from CAFOs. So in this particular case, it's really not a matter at this point of industrial pollution. It's much more agricultural pollution. That's 90% or more of the problem.
And do you think that with this consent decree and with the TMDLs, will this lead to some regulation change around the CAFOs and the agriculture? Do you think that we will start to see some change around that?
We believe it has to. As again, I mentioned, it's just a math problem. The state of Ohio is committed to reduce phosphorus pollution by 90%. Excuse me, by 40%. My apologies. 90% comes from the agricultural sector. Okay, you can't reduce 40% if you don't deal with the 90%. And the only way to deal with the 90% is a matter of sound science to get those sorts of reductions is enforceable regulatory standards that apply to both reducing the excessive use of fertilizers. And keep in mind, if you reduce the fertilizer use to get the same output in terms of crops, that saves the farmer money. On the manure side, it's very simple. Yeah, it's a matter of math. The more CAFOs that are sited with more animals produce a predictable amount of manure. And if that manure is kept in the watershed and not treated in a way that reduces it going into the watershed, then that's phosphorus that gets into Western Lake Erie. The notion that we're somehow going to raise enough money to pay all the CAFO operators and all the large agricultural operations to reduce manure and fertilizer or not use it, there's not enough money around to do that. And there's serious questions on whether the public ought to be paying, to reduce manure that's coming from CAFOs. What needs to happen is the state of Ohio needs to, first of all, not have the loophole that they currently have, which is If a CAFO has less than 2,500 animals, then it's not subject to the permit process. So not unexpectedly, there's a fair number of CAFOs that have, say, 2,400 animals. That needs to be changed. Secondly, there needs to be a set of standards that limits where manure can be put within the watershed. It has to be treated and regulated and not simply allowed to go into the watershed, because when it does, the flow of the water as it winds up in Western Lake Erie, it creates toxic algae outbreaks, and that creates enormous economic, environmental, and social costs for everybody. This is not a free lunch. I mean, let's keep in mind, the reason the city of Toledo and the Lucas County Board of Commissioners are in the case are, first, they care about the environment in terms of Western Lake Erie. They also care about the economy in terms of fisheries, in terms of outdoor recreation. I mean, who wants to go play on a beach and go walleye fishing or go out on a boat trip when you're going through the green, ugly, toxic algae outbreaks? This is about the economic costs, and there have been a number of studies talking about hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars of economic costs from toxic algae outbreaks in Western Lake Erie that are happening every summer, and last year went through November. So we know what to do. It's about US EPA stepping up if the state of Ohio doesn't, and that requires enforceable regulatory standards that are tough but fair.
Yeah, thanks. I'm just realizing, I know you have a hard stop. I definitely have more questions for you, but we'll have to, I think, pick that.
If you want to try two more, I'll stay with you. Okay, Laura?
Okay, that's fantastic. Yeah.
I will move things around.
Okay, let me pull one up. Actually, there's one about the algal bloom staying confined to the Western Basin. Is there a risk that longstanding toxic algal problem will remain confined to the Western Basin? Could it continue to grow and be a problem outside of?
Yes. I mean, what's begun to happen is they drift. It depends on wind patterns, among other things. It drifts to the east outside of the Western Basin. So there are problems going further east and west in Lake Erie, and it goes north toward Detroit. That's begun happening. Again, if you have bad algae blooms, depending on how the winds are blowing and what the water levels are, it goes out of the immediate area in Maumee Bay near Toledo. And there was a question as well asking about BMPs with regard to fertilizers, best management practices. Mm-hmm. That's half of the problem. Fertilizers are part of it. CAFOs and manure are the other part of it. BMPs are important. BMPs alone, mandatory BMPs, to address Mark Royster's question, will not solve the problem, but there's certainly a step in the right direction. Question that was asked by somebody, it says anonymous attendee. Can wetlands help? Yes, wetlands can help, and the Supreme Court's recent decision in the Sackett case really does make that more difficult in terms of what are jurisdictional under federal law and what are not jurisdictional wetlands. With regard to the question asked about the two components of the TMDL plan by John Livernoy, the first is setting the total. The second question, of course, is how do you allocate that? Yes, that's correct. The total really is a legal issue that's defined by the Clean Water Act. The total, the pollution diet, is the amount of reduction that's sufficient so that the Western Lake Erie waters are not impaired. And the science behind that, under the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, Annex 4, Jeff Reuter's team, is a reduction by 40%. How that's allocated, there is flexibility, but there are really two sources here, according to the Ohio EPA. It's excess fertilizer from corn and soy fields, and it's manure from CAFOs. Clearly, you need to get progress in both places. Question from Pamela Harris is nitrogen, is that a problem too? Yes, it is. That's more than I can explain in the next couple of minutes. There have been a number of very good science papers on it. For farmer compliance on fertilizer remediation, there are things involving farm credit and such that can be helpful, but the fact of the matter is that won't get the job done here. If your goal is to clean up Western Lake Erie, it's a useful tool. It won't solve the problem. Voluntary measures are good. We don't oppose voluntary measures. What we do support is the necessary fair, enforceable regulatory standards that are sufficient so that the pollution is reduced by 40%, and that's what can solve the problem. Namely, the goal that we should all share here, and Laura, I'll sort of wrap up there. Hopefully we all share the goal that we want Western Lake Erie and Lake Erie overall to be cleaned up, so that if there happen to be toxic algae outbreaks, that's sort of a once in a blue moon thing that happens once every 10 years. It's not something that is predictably happening in a serious and severe way every summer. And for that to happen, we need action to reduce the amount of excessive fertilizers that get into Western Lake Erie and reduce the amount of manure from CAFOs. That's more than 90% of the problem. And if you want to solve the problem, you got to deal with what the source is, and that's what it is in Ohio. And again, that's Ohio EPA numbers. So the local governments here, the city of Toledo, Lucas County Board of Directors, the environmental groups, such as I represent, are all on the same page here, and we're looking to action that really solves the problem. And what we will get going forward, hopefully, is a Lake Erie that's cleaner, more enjoyable for use by everybody, safer for water, safer for fisheries, and it's something we're all proud of instead of something we look at today and we're sort of embarrassed. That's the goal. Let's clean it up.
That's a great place to end it. And I think we can all get behind that shared goal for sure. Howard, you are far better multitasker than I am, answering questions and reading the next one. So well done.
Just trying.
You're a pro. Thank you very much for staying on a little bit longer for us to try to get to all those questions, and really appreciate your time today. And thank you to the audience for joining us. Have a great day. And thanks again, Howard. Really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Good to join you.